For now, though, I'd like to introduce Jan Bieser. He's an assistant professor for digitalization and sustainability. In his research, he investigates the opportunities and risks of digitization for society and the environment. As a fellow of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Councils on Cities of Tomorrow, Jan Bieser worked with a representative of cities, the private sector, and international organizations to explore how digital technologies can make cities more sustainable and equitable. So let's give a massive round of applause for Jan Bieser.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the nice introduction. Quick question, is this good with the sound now, or is there a problem? Okay. Perfect. Yeah, thank you for the nice introduction. And overall, thank you so much for inviting me here to speak today. I think it's pretty amazing that I think for the 5th time I heard you have the summer school is happening. I was actually part of a summer school called ICT for Sustainability Summer School, I think in 2020 or 2019 in Leiden, not so far away from here. But this never continued, and it seems to me now that the SICT summer school is really continuing over a longer period. That's really, really nice. Yeah, my name is Jan. I work at Bern University of Applied Sciences since roughly 1.5 years. Very briefly about myself, I have a background originally in business informatics, but all really working.
We're going to switch the mics. We tried. Sorry.
I can also talk without a mic, or is it?
I don't know. It's quite close enough. Can everyone hear, Jan?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk loud, I think. But is it good for Zoom then?
No, because there are some people on Zoom.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Please remind me if I.
You're great. Don't worry.
Okay, let's try it like that. Yeah, I have a background in business informatics. So I'm originally from Germany, from southern Germany. Have a background, studied there business informatics, and then worked a little bit in the industry and consulting, all for Deutsche Telekom and some other companies, where I was part of the corporate responsibility departments, where we actually tried to figure out how can we reduce the emissions of those companies. But then at some point I realized that I have actually no clue about sustainability because it was not a big part of my business informatics studies. And then I wanted to do a PhD, which I did in Zurich in the Informatics and Sustainability Research Group with Lorenz Hilty, who just retired actually. So the group doesn't, just like 2 months ago, he had his final lecture. And then I did a postdoc at KTH Stockholm. They also have quite a focus since a long time on sustainable digitalization. They even, I think since this semester, started a new master program in sustainable digitalization, actually, which is, to my knowledge, the first master program, maybe even in the world, which focuses specifically on this topic. Yeah, and then I went, however, back to Switzerland, and now since 1.5 years, I'm at Bern University of Applied Sciences, and there at the Institute Public Sector Transformation. Most of my colleagues have a strong focus on how can we digitize the public sector and make it more efficient. And I look at all of that from a sustainability angle. And today I'm talking about the digital dilemma, climate threat or enabler for net zero, and try to provide a little bit an overview of the potential effects of digitalization on energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, and whether it's more a problem or a solution. And yeah, I have a lot of slides, but I try to make them very light with a lot of images, so I hope it's not too heavy. I like to start. No, perfect. I like to start with a little bit of a look back. If you think about the history of the planet, actually, from the formation of the Earth until today, where are we now, and put this all on a time scale of 24 hours. Then, of course, at 0 o'clock was the formation of the Earth. At 1 o'clock, the moon formed. Then bacteria started to produce oxygen, maybe at around 9 o'clock. And Okay. Multicellular life started at around 4 o'clock. Then we had the first plants on land at 7, first dinosaurs only at 10 o'clock. And us humans, only from this perspective, have only existed for a few seconds. And why am I showing this is to emphasize how long it took to create actually conditions on this planet that sustain our life actually, which is quite a coincidence. We have the right temperature, the right distance to the sun, the right atmosphere, and a lot of things that had to happen for us to sustain, this planet to sustain our lives. And now we zoom in the last couple of milliseconds or something like that from this perspective and look at what happened actually in the last milliseconds here. So you see here what Steffen et al. Call the great accelerations. You see a time frame from 1750 until the year, I think, 2010. And you see specifically since the 1950s, several environmental impact categories increased tremendously. Our energy use, our loss of tropical rainforest, which is basically the lung of the earth. The surface temperature, as we all know, increased tremendously. And we see that these developments for other environmental impact indicators as well. And Steffen et al. Call this even the great acceleration. So in the last, let's say, 70 years or something like that, we're really trying very hard to maybe return this development, which we had for such a long time, to create these conditions which sustain our life. And this is an analogy from Scientists for Future. Okay, that doesn't seem to work. I tried like this now. Ah, we're not focused on the green, I think. Now it works. Yeah. All good. And I try to move this a little bit away now. Okay, like this is fine, I think. But now I have to click back on the slideshow, I think. So it works. Yeah. So this is an analysis from Scientists for Future. What if aliens came to our planet and tried to investigate us scientifically? They could put forward the hypothesis that we're trying to transform fossil carbon into global warming CO2 as fast as possible. And I think it's quite interesting to think about this from this perspective. What if others looked at us and tried to understand what we are doing? But back to the great acceleration. Now, since the 1950s here, we see this great acceleration. But then there was one acceleration which went way, way faster than many others did in the past. I think if we look at technology adoption curves in history, I don't think there was any technology which we adopted to so fast. So the number of mobile phone subscriptions, the smartphone ownership, the amount of data we transfer over the internet or over our networks has increased at such incredible pace. And that is important, fundamentally changes how we communicate, how we work, how we travel, and so on. And because the fact that we have telecommunications creates so many changes in our life, it also impacts, of course, the environmental impacts of many other activities that we do. And this is actually what we look in our research, trying to understand what is the impact of digital technologies or the digital transformation on the environment. And in our research, we usually distinguish two types of effects to look at that, which makes it easier to look at. It's the direct effect or the footprint, and on the other side, the indirect effects, often called also the handprint. So with the footprint, what do we mean with that? With the footprint, we mean what it requires actually just that our devices are there. So all of our devices, like a smartphone, needs to be produced, needs to be operated, and at its end of life, will be disposed somewhere. Now this and all the environmental impacts which happen on this journey are called the footprint. And then the handprint actually describes that we don't just produce this technology because it looks so nice. No, we do things with this technology, and it changes, again, how we travel, how we operate our buildings, and so on. And it changes processes in all our life domains and with consequences for the environment. And these environmental consequences of ICT applications in other domains is what we call the handprint. And I will look now in the presentation at both parts separately. And I start, of course, with the footprint. So with the footprint, what we mean is that ICT hardware needs to be produced. That requires a lot of resources. It needs to be operated. That requires electricity usually. Our smartphones, our data centers, and so on require electricity to run. And then at its end of life, it will be disposed. And I go through each step now, and we're going to look at some environmental hotspots of each step here, starting with the production. Now, in the production phase, one of the biggest environmental impacts is because our hardware is very resource intensive. This is a very interesting study. They looked actually at what elements are required for smartphone production, and they found that more than 50% of the elements in the periodic table are required to produce smartphones. So you see here the periodic table. I have not a lot of knowledge about the individual elements here, but it's just a big number that we need more than 50% of it. And most importantly, most of this doesn't come from obsolete devices which have been recycled. No, most of these elements are mined out of the earth crusts, and this requires a lot of energy, a lot of effort, and of course, these resources are not abundant that we have unlimited amounts of them. So this is an issue. So we also need to think about how can we replace them, how can we use less of them. And a lot of these elements are also considered problematic for several reasons. I try to categorize these into 3 categories here. We have critical elements. Critical elements is more an economic perspective, where we know that our economy depends heavily on these elements. And if we ever have an interruption of the supply, the economic consequences would be quite severe. Then we have conflict minerals. That basically means that the mining and the trade of these elements fuels basically corruption, it fuels money laundering, and it violates human rights. And then we have hazardous substances, which basically just means these are toxic things for the environment, or they might cause health problems for humans. So this is also something we have to bear in mind and work on, basically. And these were just 2 highlights in the production phase. Now, if we move forward to the operation phase, what do we need in the operation of our ICT hardware? It's mainly electricity, or it's only electricity, actually. And there are 2 questions. How much electricity do we need? And where does this electricity come from? When we look at how much electricity we need, not sure if many of you know this already, or if it has been part of this summer school already, but this is Kumi's law. What he looked at was how many calculations. He looked at different microprocessors or different generations or technologies of microprocessors or of chips, and he showed on the vertical axis how many calculations, basically how much performance do I get out of these microprocessors per kilowatt hour of electricity that I put in. And you see that it's increasing over time. And he found that between 1946 and 2009, the energy efficiency, so to say, doubled every 1.57 years, which is a tremendous success story. The energy efficiency of this technology increased tremendously. However, it has to be kept in mind. I'm not an IT engineer, but there are more and more people saying that we will reach a limit to these improvements. We cannot continue like this forever due to physical limitations in the way we build chips today. However, we have seen this energy efficiency increases, and of course, a logical consequence would be if we increase the energy efficiency, we require less energy. But unsurprisingly, this is not the case. This is based on a study which measures the electricity consumption of the ICT sector as a whole, in this case from 2007 until 2020, and they showed that it's increasing over time. And this is because while we got more energy efficient, the demand for ICT rose even faster and outpaced the energy efficiency increases, actually. So from a net perspective, we require more energy, actually. And of course, this is a challenge because we do not have yet enough renewable energy available to power all of the IT, but also all of our mobility needs, our household needs, and so on. So this is about how much energy do we need. The second question is, where does this energy come from? Because depending on which energy carrier we use to generate the electricity, a different degree of environmental impacts will occur. So whether I use coal, or whether I use nuclear power, or whether I use solar or wind power. And when we look at the CO2 emissions from electricity generation in different countries, the differences are quite incredible. I mean, we all probably know that some countries like Germany and so on, they use more coal power. That's why it's higher. But I'm also always surprised when I look at these tremendous differences that, for example, a kilowatt hour of electricity generated in China causes 111 more times CO2 than a kilowatt hour of electricity produced in Norway. And of course, the top countries, they depend to a large extent today still on coal. I'm not sure how many of you have followed the discussion in Germany. Germany went out of nuclear power. And after Fukushima back then, it was a big debate, should we rely on nuclear power? And back then the notion went away from it, and Germany decided that. And now they actually went out, but from today's perspective, I'm not sure if they would have taken this decision again, because nuclear power, of course, is very CO2 friendly, but of course also has other issues. But what is also important to consider here is that the production of ICT equipment often happens. The production of ICT equipment usually doesn't happen in countries with very climate-friendly electricity. It often happens in those countries where a lot of coal, for example, is still used, which is why it's also very important to utilize more renewable energies in the production of ICT equipment, not only during its use. And now we go to the last step, which is the disposal stage. So ideally, we use our devices as long as possible, specifically our end user devices, because the production is very resource and energy intensive, and the longer we use them, the less devices we basically have to produce. If we would double the lifetime of all our smartphones, we would only need to produce half of them. However, for every device, we will have an end of life, and then the question is, what happens to our devices then? And it is very important that we work on regaining the resources contained in our devices, because there's a lot of resources in there. What you see here is a study which calculated the share between two values. So on the top, we have the quantity of a resource contained in all smartphones sold between 2012 and 2017. So basically, it's all the smartphones which were around in 2017, divided by the global production of the respective resource in 2016. And you see that for some resources, it's between 20 and 25% of the annual production of that resource is contained in the smartphones in the respective years, which is a tremendous amount. And that's just smartphones, not considering all other ICT devices. This is why it's very important to gather or to recover these resources there. But it is a challenge to do so. Here you see two images from a quite advanced industrial recycling process of ICT equipment or e-waste in general. And to be said, this is one of, not the best, but one of the best technology we have nowadays, and not all our ICT equipment ends up there. It's only a fraction which ends up there. A lot of it is informally recycled or thrown in the trash or something. So this is one of the best ways, things that can happen today to an ICT device that is not used anymore, to enter such a process. But you see that at some point in this process, the stuff is just shredded. And then you have what you see in the right picture, and then they try to regain these resources or recover these resources, but this process has a limited efficiency. So we're far away from getting 100% or something like that out of it. So this is a challenge. It's also an economic question, what actually makes sense, how much effort should we put in to regain the resources? Because if the resale price is lower than what we have to pay to regain them, it's also from an economic perspective not really worthy. So we have to improve the recycling as well. And I mean, there is efforts being done. This is it's an advertisement film from Apple, where they advertise a robot they designed to disassemble iPhones. And you see that the technology gets actually better. So in this case, they're not shredding something anymore. They're actually trying to disassemble it automatically with a robot. And that has a potential to increase the recovery rate of the resources we have in there. But it's still a challenge, specifically when we get e-waste. It's not that it's all, now we know, okay, this e-waste is just iPhone 15s, or this e-waste is just iPhone 16s or iPhone 13s. We have a lot of different devices, and often the e-waste streams contains a lot of different devices, different generations, and so on. And it's very difficult. Such a robot needs to be trained for certain devices only. So you cannot apply this to all the e-waste we have out there yet. And on top, despite the recovery rate, we also have to make sure the e-waste actually gets into these processes. What you see here is a typically stream where e-waste goes through. So we have e-waste, and then only a share of it is collected, actually, is going into industrial recycling. As said earlier, a lot of the e-waste doesn't end up in these processes at all. They can go into household waste, and then they will be incinerated or something like that. There's also a lot of informal recycling. So a lot of countries, through some funny supply chains, the e-waste ends up in Africa or in China, and there are some informal e-waste recycling hotspots where it doesn't look like an industrial process, where stuff is actually burned to get the resources out, to get the plastic away. And of course, this has many toxic impacts on the environment there, but also the humans doing that. So we have to work on collecting it and targeting it towards the right waste streams. But what you see here is that every step here has a limited efficiency. So in the end of the day, we are far away from 100%, and we have to work on making that better as well. So now we looked at each step of the life cycle of an ICT device, actually. And now the question is, if we take the whole ICT sector together, so all our devices, all our ICT infrastructures, how much emissions do they cause considering the whole life cycle? It's very difficult to estimate, but some researchers try. And they agree to some extent that it's somewhat in the area of 1.5 to 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions caused by the ICT sector. Doesn't seem like that much, but just as a comparison, I think the air travel, so the flying sector, causes somewhat between 2 and 3% of emissions, of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's in the same magnitude. So it is quite relevant. And considering that it's growing in the future, or it's expected to grow in the future, while we actually have to reduce emissions, the problem will become even bigger. And what causes these emissions? Usually, studies look at 3 different parts. They look at our end user devices, our smartphones, laptops, desktop computers, and so on, the data centers, and the networks. And each of these components makes up some share of this. While back in the days, it seemed like end user devices cost a little bit more. By now, it seems a bit, the studies show end user devices cost a little bit less, and data center share is a bit increasing because of the tremendous amounts of data volumes, for example, for video streaming and so on, which run through our data centers. The question is, how do we reduce this? I mean, I know there are some experts in this room who know way more about the technology, but by tendency for infrastructure, so networks and data centers, the operation, the use phase is very relevant. This is because the stuff is operated 24/7 around the clock and requires electricity around the clock. Even when it's not very highly utilized, it requires a lot of electricity. This is why here's a lot of focus on the operating phase to reduce the impacts during operation, which we do if we increase the energy efficiency, which we do if we utilize energy from renewable energies, and if we only operate as much infrastructure as necessary, which is a challenge because, for example, networks have to be built for peak demand, which doesn't happen very often. I was once told that peak demand, for example, can happen at the Football World Cup, where the whole world is basically streaming and the networks have to withstand this demand. but most of the time this is actually not required. So it's a challenge to build only as much infrastructure as necessary. And for end user devices, a lot of focus is actually not so much on the operating phase, because our devices are very mobile nowadays and they're already limited by the battery we have in there. So they're designed very much for energy efficiency. So regarding to the infrastructures, the operating phase isn't so relevant here. Here it's more the production phase, also because there's just so many of these devices out there. And so here it's all about greening the supply chain and also producing fewer devices. So we don't have to produce as many devices. For example, if we use them longer, or if we have less devices per person, if we don't have like everybody has one smartphone or even two smartphones, one for work, one for private use, a tablet, a laptop, a smartwatch, and so on. So these are the biggest measures, or the high-level measures. How can we reduce the footprint of the ICT sector? Where does the future go? It's difficult to say. Will it increase or decrease in the future? This is based on a very nice paper by Freitag et al. The link is down there. They listed a couple of reasons why it could decrease in the future or why it could increase in the future. And the reasons for the decrease is that we shift, for example, to more efficient end user devices. Nowadays, we often stream on our smartphones or tablets instead of a huge TV. And that is more efficient because the displays are smaller. We don't need to transfer as much data because the resolution is smaller. We also use by tendency more and more renewable energies. That's also positive. We also see for some devices an increasing service lifetime. I think in Switzerland, the average service lifetime of a smartphone until maybe 10 years ago or something like that, or maybe 10 years is too much because I think the iPhone came, 2007 or so it came out. So maybe, let's say 6 years ago was more like 2.5, 3 years. By now we're more at 4 years. Not sure if this is for environmental reason or because these devices became much more expensive, but that would be in principle a positive effect. And then we also see saturation effects because more and more people have a device already. So smartphone sales even went down for a couple of years because the market was a little bit saturated already. But then there's, of course, reasons for an increase. We have increasing data volumes. Think of AI, metaverse if it's coming back, but also all the video content we send around. We have more end-user devices maybe as through the Internet of Things. Not only people will get connected to the internet, but our lights, our cars, and everything as well. As said earlier, the continuous energy efficiency increases we saw in ICT in the past might decrease in the future. And of course, the ICT sector wants to grow. They want to make more revenue, want to make more profits. So they're also looking for ways how they can grow. And for example, invent the new device categories and so on. Now we have the smartwatch, which a lot of people have already, but who knows what the future will bring. And I would say the prevailing opinion is that the ICT footprint rather increases in the future, so that the increasing effects outweigh the decreasing effects. These are some extrapolations based on a meta study of other studies of the future footprint of the ICT sector, and by tendency, they're all increasing. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty in there, but it seems to be the prevailing opinion. And this I just want to show because it's, in my opinion, very interesting. What you see here is the energy use of two companies, Alphabet, so the company behind Google, and Meta, the company behind Facebook and WhatsApp. And you see the top line is the revenue they made between 2015 and 2020. And the bottom line is the energy use of those companies. And you see basically they're increasing at a similar rate. So there seems to be some coupling between actually growth, their target, revenue increase, and their energy use. We do not know if this continues in the future, but if it does, it is problematic because this would mean as they grow, they require more and more energy in the future. And one reason which is often discussed these days is, of course, AI or machine learning, to be a bit more precise. I mean, we're just starting to understand the energy use of AI here, and we do not know for sure where it goes in the future, but specifically for large models which consider, for example, a lot of parameters like our large language models like ChatGPT and the like, and which are used by a lot of people globally. the energy use can be quite significant. And here's just a quotation of the chairman of Alphabet who says, well, an exchange with AI likely costs 10 times more than a conventional keyword search. But it's very important to consider this only applies for these large models. It's not that every machine learning model requires a lot of energy. This only applies to large models. But still, it is significant. However, we do not know yet what the future will hold here as well, because the algorithms and the hardware, of course, becomes more energy efficient, but our demand also increases. Nevertheless, the authors of this study also suggest that instead of just improving AI, we should also define more criteria when actually should we use AI at all, or should we use ML at all, because it might not actually benefit all applications. Right now, we are a little bit in a phase where everybody's experimenting with it, but in the future, maybe we should really, before we utilize it, actually critically reflect, do we really need this for this application? And whether we really need AI, this doesn't really apply only to machine learning or AI, it applies, I think, to digital technology in general. Do we actually always use digital technology for purposeful things, for meaningful things? And this is just a funny example, for example, the self-adjusting belt. This is just one example where we also utilize digital technology today for. So if you ate a lot, your belt automatically increases a little bit, or the selfie toaster, where you can take a picture and 5 minutes later have it on your toaster. Quite a funny game, but is it really meaningful? Do we really use digital technology here in a meaningful way? I mean, it can at least be questioned. But while these examples, of course, are a little bit ridiculous, you can really ask those questions. What are we using actually digital technology for? Do we use it for the right things? And this shocked me a little bit. This was published by the Financial Times, and it shows the share of US teenagers who say that in blue, they meet their friends only rarely, and in red, it does not feel good to be alive. And you see, since the introduction of the smartphone, this increased tremendously. Of course, it's difficult to prove the causality here, but there's a more and more researchers who say actually there is an effect of smartphones specifically coupled with social media leading to such developments. And from that perspective, you can ask the questions, are we really using this technology for meaningful interactions between humans, or are other forces driving the use these days actually, which lead, amongst others, to these consequences? And what we are using digital applications for, this is basically what the indirect effect focus on. So we now talked about the direct effects, the footprint. Now we talk a little bit about the indirect effects, or the handprints, or the impacts digital technology has on other sectors like energy, buildings, mobility, and so on, and the consequences for the environment or for emissions there. And there is a big assumption around there, at least was for a long time, but I believe it's still there, that what is digital is more sustainable. So here's a quote, and I feel like I showed this a couple of times already, but now for the first time in Brussels, where it was probably said. At the heart of this will be our growth strategy, the European Green Deal, and the twin transition and opportunity of digitalization and decarbonization. So through digital technology, we might be able to decarbonize. And this assumption doesn't come from anywhere. There have been a tremendous amount of studies who actually try to estimate how much emissions we can save by digitalizing our economy. And this is just one study which was published, I think, half a year ago or something in Germany by Accenture. And they actually looked at different ICT applications in different sectors. For example, at smart grids in the energy sector, at building automation, at energy optimization and industrial production, at precision agriculture, or in the transport sector, at video calls, at ride sharing, at car sharing. And they estimated in Germany, through all these applications jointly, by 2030, we can save 50 megatons of CO2 emissions, which would equal 7% of the emissions in 2022. So a tremendous contribution of digital applications to contribute to climate protection. And they didn't stop here. This was the business as usual scenario. So with the planned digitalization, they said, if we digitalize even faster, this will increase to 72 or 10% of the emissions. So if we digitalize faster, we save more emissions. And what is the notion which comes out of these studies, in my opinion, is that more digitalization equals less emissions. And this is where this belief comes from such studies. And I have to be very honest, I was also involved in such studies in the past. Today I'm criticizing these again. I mean, I think it's very important to look at the positive side as well and look at the opportunities, but it's also important to not create the notion out there that just digitalization will solve our problems, because that actually hinders real action and the required action we need. But I want to talk a little bit about now why I think this is actually not the case. More digitalization always equals less emissions. And I brought two reasons why the results of such studies might not be actually happen in real life. And the first reason is that the climate protecting effects of digitalization are often overestimated. They're considered higher than they actually are in real life. And the damaging effects of digital applications to other sectors, to the emissions of other sectors, or the increasing effects, are often overlooked. And I brought two examples. Quickly want to look at the time. I brought two examples. I brought an example for both sides. The first one is the climate protecting effects of digitalization are often overestimated. So what you see here is a study by the University of Zurich. What they estimate, that they wanted to understand, is video conferencing actually climate friendly? And they took a scenario, let's assume a business trip from Zurich to Paris and back, and compared the emissions which occur with different means of transport. So by car, plane, train, or by conducting a video call for 4 hours. And they showed that if I travel there by car or by plane, I cause 300 times more emissions than when I conduct a video conference, considering all the equipment, the energy use, and the networks you require for that, and so on. So in principle, I could conduct this video, only if I conduct a video conference for 1,200 hours or more, would the video conference cause more emissions than the trip back and forth. So basically, this means there's a tremendous potential of video conferencing to avoid emissions from business-related travel. The question is, does this really happen? Because what is often and very often overlooked is that, do video conferences actually substitute business travel? Do they lead to less business travel? Only then do we actually avoid emissions and reduce emissions. And I mean, I don't know to what degree they do, but I read some studies and they are quite uncertain to what degree they do, and probably it's not as big as we expect. I know one study where they collaborated in Sweden with a lot of public institutions and really put a lot of effort into reducing business travel, new policies, they trained employees, they put all the equipment there, and even there, under these really, where they put a lot of effort in, they reached, I think, a reduction of less than 10%. And at the same time, we also know that the forecasts of the, for example, flight industry, they are still going highly up about how much we fly in the future. So we have to consider in this, and often this is not considered, that video conferencing, yes, in principle, it can avoid emissions, but only if it substitutes, and that's not the case. So even for applications, such a low-hanging fruit like video conferencing, is not very clear to what degree they actually avoid emissions. And the other example, climate damaging effects are often overlooked, and this is an example of the rebound effect you might have heard already. Let's look at music streaming. Music streaming. So back in the days, people were listening to music over vinyls, then we had the CD, and today we stream. Or in between we downloaded, and now we stream. And here they estimated the emissions per 1 hour of music listening with these different technologies. And we see that streaming causes the least amount of CO2 emissions. Again, a great potential through music streaming to reduce emissions. However, at the same time, the cost of accessing music decreased also significantly, and the comfort as well. So here you see the numbers from 1977. A vinyl cost $29, a CD in 2022, and a digital album in 2013, $11. And of course, today with Spotify and the like, it got even cheaper. And as access becomes cheaper and easier, we utilize it way, way, way more. And then they compared also how much emissions, try to estimate how much emissions does the music industry cause. It's not the entire music industry they showed here, but they showed that the production of vinyls, plastic for vinyls, back then cost 140 kilotons of CO2 globally, and the storage and distribution of digital music in 2013 cost 200 to 350 kilotons of CO2. So again, even though we became more and more efficient, which is great and has a lot of social benefits because we can access music better, we do not have a net reduction of emissions here. And that is a typical rebound effect as digital applications make different services, products cheaper, easier accessible, more comfortable, more convenient. We tend to use them more, and this is what we call the rebound effect. And another example, and what I want to show of this here is actually that often business models of digital services are actually in conflict with climate protection. Now, let's think of the business model of many digital platforms, for example, a search engine or a social media platform. How do they make a profit these days? Mainly with advertisement. So whenever we are on such a platform and we click on an ad, there's a little amount of money from the company placing this advertisement transferred to the platform provider. So they actually have an incentive that we click on as many ads as possible because then they make more revenues. This means that they actually want to increase the time we spend on digital platforms. Because if we spend more time on digital platforms, then they can show us more ads and they can collect more data about people to again personalize the advertisements and so on to make them more effective, increasing the likelihood that we click on it. And so we might even end up in clicking on more advertisements, leading us directly to an online shop or something and buying something, which of course causes emissions because it has to be produced, it has to be shipped over, whatever it is. Maybe it's clothes, maybe it's consumer electronics or something else. Now, advertisement exists since a long time, and I mean, the question is advertisement problematic? I do not want to solve that, but I want to show that with in the internet or on digital platforms, we have a new degree of advertisement, which we did not have in the past. If you think of a billboard outside, it's the same advertisement for all of us. Everybody sees the same thing. Online, it's personalized, it's adapted to our personal preference, or at least what they assume are our preferences. And it became so far that actually manipulative techniques are being developed and used to make us use this technology more. And there are even words for it, which are called addictive design and dark patterns. So addictive design means the techniques to design digital technology in a way that it's very good in raising our attention and that we spend as much time as possible with it. If you think about online streaming, YouTube, back in the days, you watched the video and then the video was over and it was over. Maybe after the video, you got a recommendation what to watch next. Nowadays, when you watch Netflix or YouTube, the recommendation what you have to watch next doesn't come after the video. It comes maybe a minute towards the end of the video or 30 seconds until the end of the video. So you see it directly and might click on it, often even autoplay that you're really getting hooked on right away again. Or there was a lot of discussion about the like button. Not sure if it was intended like that, but that the like button, whenever I post something and somebody likes it, I have a little bit dopamine release in my brain. I have a little kick, I feel good. And so the likelihood increases that I post another thing or that I look in again and so on. And there are many other techniques like that which intend to attract our attention. And dark patterns, it's a bit a newer term, basically means that to design digital, to make people online do things online they actually do not want to do through design measures. So techniques which belong in this category are that, for example, it's often very easy to click on to subscribe to something. Sometimes we don't even notice that we subscribe to something because we have to actively opt out or something. But to cancel the subscription is very, very difficult. That's very, very difficult. It's one of these techniques which falls into this category. And with this techniques, I mean, we are at a new form of manipulating users. And I'm not a psychologist, but I would strongly assume that we're far away from that. Myself and generally digital consumers are actually in charge of how we use digital technology. It's a lot about that the technology influences us as well. And this is because, I mean, these things occur because the business model works as it is based on our time, data, and advertisement. And this is stuff we also have to work on, I think. So these are the two examples I brought. And now I wanted to say that we actually need to understand better what actually the impacts of digital applications on emissions is in order for us to promote the good impacts and minimize the damaging impacts. We need better criteria, what is really climate friendly or not. And I mean, we started a little bit later. Can I still talk for 5 to 10 minutes, or is this a problem? Okay. We need better criteria of what is actually sustainable. And I just brought two examples from other industries because it doesn't only apply to digital applications. Not sure who of you is aware of CO2 compensation. So most companies nowadays, David is aware of it. Okay, yeah, maybe raise your hands if you've heard of CO2 compensation. Okay, you all are interested in sustainability anyways. Yeah, so companies in principle, they want to reduce their CO2 emissions. They can do that through actual reductions, or if they do not manage to reduce it enough, they can buy CO2 certificates. How does it work? There's a climate protection project somewhere in the world, and the company can invest in that project, and then they quantify how much CO2 emissions did this project save, so to say, and then the company can deduct this from their own CO2 emissions because they supported that project. So often these projects are projects that try to stop deforestation. This project, which is referred to here, was conducted by the biggest emission CO2 certificate company in the world. It's actually based in Switzerland. And it's the project was in Southern Africa, a deforestation project. So they went down there and protected this forest and said, because we protect this forest, we save trees, and those trees suck out CO2 from the atmosphere. Now the challenge is, how much CO2 did we actually save here? To calculate that, you need to estimate how would this forest have developed if we wouldn't have protected it. Only then you know how much trees we actually saved. And this baseline scenario, what would have happened if we wouldn't have come, is hypothetically. And you have to calculate based on assumptions. And then it came actually out that here they basically, the calculation didn't seem very realistic because they compared it to many other forests, similar forests, and they showed that the other forests which were not protected developed actually very similar. But in the meantime, they sold a lot of CO2 certificates to many companies, Gucci, Disney, Shell, many of whom who claimed to be CO2 neutral or reduce their emissions and so on. But the emissions which were written on the certificates were not worth it, basically. Yeah. And another example, not sure how much are you into sustainable finance, but I saw this post on LinkedIn the other day by a Swiss sustainable finance company. And I thought it was also quite interesting, an interesting example for that we need better criteria for what is sustainable actually. So basically in the last 5 years, ESG impact investment, sustainable investment, climate-friendly investing had a big hype. And I had the feeling everything was suddenly sustainable, even though the companies and the funds were the same ones. And now the Swiss lawmakers said, actually, guys, you as a industry, the finance industry, you have to set clearer criteria, otherwise we intervene. And this might actually lead to the fact that 80% of the funds or investment products which are today labeled as sustainable might lose this characteristic actually, which is quite tremendous. And how should a end consumer who wants to invest or something has not so much clue about the stuff actually now understand what is actually sustainable or not. And I'm just worried that in the future, we at some point will have a city where we have a lot of offices, companies, and every company has a placard on it saying we are carbon neutral, we are even net positive and so on. But above the city, we have this big cloud of emissions still. And this would be a problem, and it would hinder real climate protection. and how to get out of it. And I don't have a lot of time. Overall, we do not know the net impacts of digitalization on CO2 emissions, but there is a little bit a notion out there that most people believe, well, the positive and negative effects cancel each other out. So we have to do target measures to actually utilize digitalization for climate protection. It doesn't happen by itself. And with that, I think I don't have time anymore. Yeah. All I want to say, yeah, perfect. The technology tells me to stop. All I want to say is in the end, well, we can change the regulation, the framework conditions, for example, through regulation, through carbon pricing, to incentivize companies to actually align their activities with environmental protection or climate protection. Or we could also look at business models. How can we change business models in a way that actually making more revenue goes hand in hand with more climate protection? But with that, I think I'm out of time, and I thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, thanks for inviting me.
So we have time for 1 or 2 questions. I can see a few hands up already. We can maybe get through 3 or 4 or 5. Well, we'll go through 2. And you're going to be here all day? Are you going to be here all day? Until lunch? Oh, brilliant. Let's see if we can prioritize some of the questions then. I am going to go, I don't know, is there someone back here that had a question? Someone close to me? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm not an engineer, and I have to share the feeling that I don't feel always comfortable with those assessments of, like, some sort of cost benefit analysis of the impact, because it seems like we always lag behind technological developments, and I'm not sure we can afford that. And we don't really look at the root cause of why we do lag behind. So I like the opening of yours that we should look into business cases, and I think it's even more than business cases. So yeah, I'd like to hear some more about that. And the other thing is, why focusing on net zero? Because we know that this is only a small portion of the problem. This is not even all about the climate impact. And then we also have biodiversity, which is maybe even more complicated, even more problematic, because we cannot build back biodiversity. So how do we take this into account?
I mean, all I can say regarding this is that I agree, and I wish I would have the answer how we can get there. My last slide, which I don't actually show now, would say we have to go away from saying what can we do with digital technology, but what needs to change for sustainability or for sustainability transformation, and how can we utilize digital technology to enable this change. But I truly have the feeling that we are still more technology driven and think about what can we do with digital technology. But I see a little bit of positive development, because I would say 10 years ago when I started in this field, I was really out there, not among researchers, but among policymakers, companies. The assumption digital is always better. Now we are a step further, where there are some groups, for example, at the European Commission and so on, looking into this. The Green Digital Coalition, for example, and they are aware at least that not everything is good. But we're still far away from really discussing what or really promoting the desired and the undesired and mitigating the undesired ways of utilizing ICT. And I think it's a continuous effort, but I don't have the solution. How do we get there? Yeah. And I'm not an environmental scientist, and I'm aware that the climate problem is one of the biggest one, and the biodiversity is one of the biggest one, and they surely are related to some extent as well. And definitely we should consider them all together. I focused today on CO2 emissions, and I couldn't explain how exactly they are interrelated, but of course it's such a multidimensional problem, which is why also a lot of researchers go more and more into systems modeling techniques, because today I talked a lot about individual applications like video conferencing, car sharing, and so on. These are just individual applications, but in the end, they all happen at the same time and interact with each other and change how we behave. And that has and it's important to understand these interactions. And a lot of researchers actually try to go more into system dynamics to understand these effects and understand how little changes on one screw will have an effect on the whole system. But it is challenging to come up with these models. Yeah.
That much.
Yeah, I wanted to actually bring three examples, but then I ran out of time. But these are at least discussed. I'm not saying that they're mainstream. I mean, often I think often you have very convinced entrepreneurs and so on who want to consider that early on, and they actually do that. But then the next question is, do they manage to become mainstream and really get high traction? I don't know how often that happens. The examples I wanted to bring is, and I mean, they happen, but they're also not mainstream yet, is with smartphone producers. I mean, we buy smartphones, so they basically means the smartphone producers make more profit if we buy more smartphones and produce more. And if you would change to a business model of renting them out, this would change because, sorry.
No,
Yeah.
go.
If you change from selling smartphones to renting out smartphones, you would at least say, okay, we not make more profit or revenues by selling more smartphones. Actually, we rent it out. We get a monthly subscription fee or something for a long time. And we actually now have an incentive that this person doesn't need a new device, because if we have to give them a new device, it would cost more. Or, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I rephrased because I think it was maybe too wide. With what you just said, you also highlight like selling less device, just as you say now, doing as a service, and so selling more less device. But then my question more precise would be, how could this go hand in hand with like an industry, a business model industry like ICT, which is mainly based on like producing a lot, selling a lot, and then disposal, like very linear business model. How, in your experience, have you concrete examples of places where it has been done differently?
Yeah, I cannot give you concrete examples, and I just would want to say that it's very tough to change this, because at the moment, many digital business models are just so profitable that I don't see any voluntary changes that companies will actually do to change this. And this is probably where the regulator has to come in. Specifically, I mean, I want to start a research project now on alternative social media business models, because as I said earlier, with the all advertisement, it causes many social and environmental problems, I think. And but all we will be probably able to is like to see what could be alternatives, but how to get there, to be honest, I don't know. But maybe somebody else has an idea. Yeah.
Maybe it's more of a comment, because you mentioned, you compared the emission of ICT sector to the aviation sector, and there have been a lot of discussion regarding that it's not good to make this comparison, because those are totally different sectors, and it goes to the underestimation of ICT. So I would maybe, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. And also you point out that in terms of recycling electronic waste, we are not that efficient. It's of course it's true, but there's a lot of technological bio-based technological innovation, which are using microbes and algae and other stuff, and which are gaining more momentum. And there are like a lot of startups in Germany and in New Zealand, which are actually trying to solve this issue in a more effective and environmental friendly way. And I'm just wondering if you heard maybe about any type of this new, more bio and responsible way of recycling technologies, waste especially.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And regarding your first remark, you're absolutely right. Maybe I made this comparison too quickly. Video streaming or video conferencing. I mean, video conferencing, video streaming is to some degree very similar. video conference is more stream in both directions. You can consider it like that. And I made this comparison very quick. And we actually had a newspaper in Switzerland saying streaming is the new flying. And because they are on a similar level, ICT and flying is at a similar level of emissions. But this is not if you look in, you have to look at a little bit more detailed at that, because flying is an activity which is, I think, annually done by less than 10% of the world population, because most people don't fly. It's only a few number of people, and you cannot compare 1 hour video streaming via Netflix or so to flying, any sort of flying. That's a whole different level of emission. So that's very important. Thank you for pointing that out. And regarding the second question, I have no knowledge about the details. I mean, I know, as you said, that a lot of development in more sustainable materials also for ICT is going on. And I hope it works, and it will solve the problem of that we need more than 50% of the resources and so on for that. But more details I cannot go into here.